little weird calling myself a fan of the Dragon Age games. I only played Origins and 2 once when they came out, and then I went back to playing The Sims 3 and Fallout New Vegas respectively because it was 2009 and 2011 and Skyrim hadn't come out yet. I haven't read the comics or the novels, but I have been dabbling in fan spaces for over a decade now because my real introduction to the world of Thedas was in 2014 with Dragon Age Inquisition. That is when I fell truly, madly, deeply in love with Solus. I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm mostly kidding. Mostly. My first ever playthrough of Inquisition was as a female elven mage. I know, I am so creative. I went into the story completely blind on launch day and ended up romancing the egg because Gareth David Lloyd's voice does things to me, and because Cassandra broke my heart by somehow being straight. So I committed tens of hours into my fictional relationship with this snooty, soft-spoken, emotionally burdened, and physically restrained elf, only to be absolutely sucker-punched by the end of the game. And I loved it. Solus remains one of my favorite characters in gaming history, and I know that's a hot take, but fight me about it. I subsequently played through Inquisition several times just to see the outcomes of various branching plotlines. I got lost in a world of messy politics, race and class struggles, deep and meaningful lore, and most importantly, lively characters with complicated inner worlds and interpersonal relationships. That's not to say Inquisition was perfect, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it was good. And since the 4th installment of the franchise was set to feature one of my favorite characters as our principal antagonist, it's safe to say that my expectations were pretty high. Enter Dragon Age Dreadwolf. Oh, wait, Dragon Age Veilguard. Wait, no, actually, that's not right either. It's Dragon Age the Veilguard. The 4th mainline Dragon Age game had an incredibly turbulent development timeline, and don't worry, we will be talking about it. But for right now, all you need to know is that the developers at BioWare were working overtime, literally, to try and bring us something worthy of the Dragon Age name. Unfortunately, for me at least, they did not succeed. I finished my 100-hour playthrough out of pure spite. Pun intended. I finished every mission, I found every collectible, I got the best possible ending, and by the time the credits rolled, I was just left feeling hollow, confused, and outright angry. Since then, I've completed 2 more playthroughs and never stopped thinking about this ultimately innocuous game because I don't know how to casually engage with things like a normal person. And while I have a lot of qualms about Veilguard that span everything from minor issues with dialogue to overarching problems with tone and pacing, one character embodies all these flaws to an unfortunately perfect extent. And that character is this stupid, pretty idiot. So yeah, rather than compiling all of my gripes about this game into some kind of Jenny Nicholson-inspired, internet-friendly numbered list, I'm going to do what I do best. I'm gonna rant. And in this rant, I'm gonna use the character of Lucanis as a springboard to talk about basically everything I dislike about Dragon Age the Veilguard. And just like I did in my video about Early Access Will in Baldur's Gate 3, I'll be talking about how Lucanis appears in the finished game, all the significantly better content that was cut from the game, and how I'd change things in my dream reimagining of his story. Now, if you haven't played Veilguard and you're worried about spoilers, then I'd recommend clicking off this video now because I'm going to be laying out the entire plot of the game and talking about some of the big twists, so this is your warning. You can click off now. I don't know when an appropriate amount of time has passed, but okay, we're gonna get into it. Part 1. Look how they massacred my boy's storyline. If I'm being honest, they fumbled Lucanis right out of the gate before we even get to see him. As a member of the Assassins organization, the Antivan Crows, Lucanis is known by reputation as a mage killer. And that's great news for our player character Rook, who wants to recruit him to help save the world from some very powerful magic users. Unfortunately, Lucanis is dead. Wait, no, just kidding. In the same conversation where we learn of Lucanis' death, his grandmother and first Talon of the Crows, Katarina, divulges that he's actually very much alive and being held in the sickest looking high security prison I have ever seen. Thanks, Grandma. I hope you don't also have a short-lived fake-out death later on in this story.
Where's Katarina? The Venatori caught her in their confusion. Katerina.
Lucanis.
It's up to the player to break Lucanis out of prison, and when we do, we learn that he isn't alone. His body is co-inhabited by a spite demon named Spite, obviously. Over the course of the game, Lucanis drinks coffee, butts heads with another one of our companions, stops for coffee, roots out a traitor in the Antivan Crows, drinks more coffee, becomes the head of the Antivan Crows, celebrates with coffee, uses his assassin skills to vanquish our godlike enemies, and then, yeah, I don't actually know. Presumably he drinks more coffee, but where he goes from here, what happens to the literal spite demon inside of him, and how he moves forward after such a traumatic adventure is all up in the air. As will be the pattern with all of the issues I bring up, this isn't just a Lucanis problem. It's just that his is the most egregious case. For instance, we never get a definitive answer for why wisps are so attracted to Nev, and they never play a role in her story except as a way to interrupt a kiss during her romance arc. We don't know for sure why Davrin survives his encounter with an archdemon, or why the character that gets blighted at the end of the game suffers no long-term ill effects. To be fair, there are hints to all of the loose plot threads that I just mentioned, and I'm not going to go through all of them because this video is supposed to mainly be about Lucanis and I don't want to get too distracted, but for his story, there are some things that we can charitably add to our headcanon. Like, depending on how he treats his traitorous cousin Ilario at the end of his personal arc, you could make assumptions on how he would rule as First Talon. And he does have a conversation with the player that speaks to how he might deal with spite at a later date, but we don't actually get to see either of these things come to fruition in-game. And depending on how you played, there are even more unanswered questions, like what happens to his relationship with Nev? What happens to his relationship with Rook? What happens to his gut health after drinking such immense amounts of coffee? And why did any of this happen? What was the point of any of it? When Katarina tells us that Lucanis is alive and being held prisoner by the Venatori, it plays like a soap opera level twist. But actually, even that's being too generous, because if you're watching a soap opera, at least you have the context of the rest of the show to support the story. This twist plays out like if you turned on your TV and caught the last 3 minutes of a soap opera without ever having watched any of the rest of the episode. We don't have any bearing on who these characters are or what their relationships are to one another, so learning that Grandma Crow has been keeping this big secret from her family means nothing to us. It's supposed to be this big dramatic reveal, but instead it's just a character telling us information. And that same mundane energy extends to Lucanis' most interesting character trait, the demon that was forcibly attached to him by his jailers. During the prison breakout quest, we're simply told, either through Rook's dialogue or by Lucanis himself, that he shares his body with a demon. The first time we see Lucanis, he shows off his sick-ass purple wings and absolutely wrecks a couple of Venatori. And the first time we see Spite is during that same mission after we defeat Caliban right here.
The crows send their regards.
Now, there are no words for how misguided of a choice I think it was to have Spite just saunter into frame like this. How is this a fitting introduction to what is essentially one half of this character? Spite is a demon, a spirit of negative emotions capable of physically harming mortal beings. He's unpredictable and almost rabid, and theoretically, an extremely important presence in Lucanis' life. And this is how we're introduced to him? And not for nothing, but we couldn't do better than a carbon copy of Lucanis fed through the Grimace filter. I actually really like the general art direction of Veilguard. I think the character creator is the best in the series by far. The environments are beautiful, and I don't mind the exaggerated, almost cartoony aesthetic of our characters and their designs. But this, I mean, talk about a letdown. What's worse is that Spite then hangs around the scene, speaking to Lucanis but invisible and inaudible to the rest of the characters. And the same goes for the following scene at the lighthouse. Rook and the others aren't aware of Spite's presence until he makes Lucanis' nose bleed, but the player can see him, which makes for some really awkward breaks in conversation, and it creates a sort of disconnect between us and the character that we're supposed to be role-playing, because while we can see Spite getting all up in Rook's business, they're none the wiser. And as far as I'm concerned, literally all of this is wrong, so hear me out, because I'm going to talk you through how I would have done Spite and Lucanis' introductions. First of all, the crows should not think that Lucanis is dead. Instead, I'd have them all collectively in on a cover-up. The public would think that Lucanis is dead, but the crows would know otherwise. My thinking is that they would purposefully maintain the rumor of his death, because Being captured by the enemy is way more dishonorable for the crows than just being killed in the line of duty. The crows in canon are known to be literal torturers and kidnappers, and it really rubs me the wrong way to see them portrayed here as good, upstanding murderers. Veilguard does this kind of thing a lot, and it really blunts the sharper edges of the world of Thetis, and it makes the narrative treat sensitive material with kid gloves. Whether it's Tosh going out of their way to tell Rook that the Lords of Fortune are ethical treasure hunters who don't steal cultural artifacts, or the Venatori's slavery being boiled down to faceless NPCs using other faceless NPCs as chairs, it feels like the game is sheltering us from sensitive material. And no, showing us gore and spooky visuals is not the same thing as actually grappling with dark subject matter. Veilguard desperately needed a more nuanced view of its world, and having the crows be cold and indifferent to Lucanis' suffering would immediately set them up as a more morally gray faction than they are in the finished game. And, as an added bonus, there would be opportunities for drama between Lucanis and his family later on. It would become Rook's job to convince the crows to free Lucanis. Doing so would be beneficial for everyone. Not only does Rook need him, but the city is under siege. A group of Qunari called the Antam are overrunning the city, systematically taking Treviso street by street and displacing the locals. The crows could use all the manpower they can get. Katarina would be totally against this, but the younger Talons, Taya and Viago, would be persuaded. As would Lucanis' cousin, the highly suspicious-looking Ilario. Seeing that she's outnumbered, Katarina would cast aside her pride and agree to help break Lucanis out of prison. She'd send a group of crows ahead to provide a frontal assault, which would give us more of a concrete reason why the place is destroyed and why all the experiments are running loose when we get there. When Rook finds Lucanis, he'd still show off his powers, and the player can note that something is very obviously wrong with him, but we don't get to know what that is just yet.
It's complicated.
I cannot stress this enough. We should not get to know about Lucanis' conditions so immediately. We miss out on so much intrigue by just being told that he's connected to a demon, so my version of his story would hold off on telling us that information. He'd still talk to Spite, like he does in the finished game.
What are you? Fine. He says he can get us across.
Who is he?
But to us, it would just seem like he's talking to himself. We'd also get to see some crows during the skirmishes for that mission, but they'd all fall in battle before the big boss fight with Caliban.
I refuse to fall.
And once Caliban is dead, then the same conversation would play out from the finished game, except we wouldn't see Spite. Let me just play the scene from the game, and then I'll play my re-edited reimagining of it. Okay, so here's the scene as it is in-game.
So we got your target.
Yes. The job's done.
Smells like blood. Ashes. Not done, not yet.
So we can leave, right? Lucanis, right?
Careful. They know we're not right.
You cannot see him. I wondered.
We clearly have things to discuss. Somewhere else.
And now here is a very rough version of what it could have looked like, and please excuse my terrible editing, I am a writer, not an editor, okay?
So we got your target.
Yes. The job's done.
So we can leave, right? Lucanis?
You cannot see him. I wondered.
We clearly have things to discuss. Somewhere else.
Agreed.
Can you feel the difference? Seeing so much of Spite so early on is like watching a horror movie where they show you the monster in broad daylight before the first kill. It cuts out any of the menace and mystery that we might have otherwise felt during those moments. And the subsequent scene in the lighthouse has the exact same issues. In my reimagined version of his story, since we don't know about Spite yet, the conversation would be quite different. Rather than talking about how to separate the assassin from his demon, the characters would be catching Lucanis up to speed on what's happening. But Lucanis would be having a hard time focusing. Between casual lines of dialogue from Balara or Nev, we would see Lucanis wincing in pain or being pestered by a disembodied voice echoing in his mind.
Let's think this through some more. There has to be...
I want to talk to
I
them.
have people in Marathas I can ask, but
And it would all escalate until...
I wouldn't get my hopes up.
I want to talk to
Lucanis!
Nope.
We'd get to see a glimpse of Spite, but that's all. Nev would immediately recognize that he's a demon, and the vibe would turn suddenly very distrustful and very afraid. Lucanis would have to be the one to calm everyone down.
It's fine. I'm fine.
From there, the same conversation from the game about separating Lucanis from Spite could play out, just with a more hostile overtone. This is an extremely dangerous secret to try and keep, and nobody likes the idea of lodging with a demon. The suggestion of killing Lucanis to rid everyone of the threat would be treated a lot more like a real possibility and less like a joke as it is in the finished game.
You'll have to kill me.
Well, that's awkward.
Lucanis would ask to be left alone to have some time for himself, retreating to his room and ending the cutscene. And yes, he would have a room. Like an actual room. The Veilguard art book has concept art of what Lucanis' room was supposed to look like before they decided to just shove him in the lighthouse's kitchen pantry. They describe his room as sparse and brooding because he doesn't sleep, and I really like that. My ideal room for Lucanis would be centrally located to the rest of the team's quarters, but nearest to the kitchen so that he could still have his precious coffee. There'd be a large window he keeps covered at all times, and a hard, perfectly made bed shoved in one corner. His weapons would be laid out meticulously on a table with like a polishing rag and a whetstone nearby, and there'd be a stack of dirty mugs piled up next to his door. After Spite's outburst, the player would be able to find Lucanis in his room and extract a little more information out of him. He'd still hold his cards pretty close to his chest, but he would tell Rook that he was the subject of horrible blood magic experimentation in prison, and that he's not the same man that he used to be before he was captured. Nevertheless, he'd commit himself to Rook's cause and tell them that he'll keep Spite in check, just as he does in the finished game. But in my version, there would be a hint that once this job is over, his life may no longer have a purpose. He would angst about how he's dishonored the Crows and dwell on the future relationship with his family, if he could have one at all. He's not mad that they left him to rot in prison. He's mad at himself for being caught in the first place. But Spite, on the other hand, would be horrifically angry with the Crows. We wouldn't get to see Spite's reaction right away, but both sides of this reasoning would eventually become part of the central conflict of Lucanis' story. And what would that story be? Well, let me tell you. Part 2, Reimagining Lucanis' story. Personally, I would omit the Katarina is dead fake out altogether in service of a storyline that's more centered around the family drama that I already outlined. In the finished game, Katarina dies so early and so off-screen that you might not even remember who she is when Thea and Biago break the news to us. I'd rather her be around to stir the pot. She had real potential in Veilguard, and I think that giving her a more prominent role in the story would give us a chance to explore that no-nonsense matriarch trope and how it relates to Lucanis' upbringing. That's sort of a thing in the full release, but it's only ever really hinted at, and I'd love to see it brought more to the forefront. In my reimagining, Lucanis' personal quest would be mostly focused on trying to get back into the Crows' good graces. They'd inform him and Rook that their efforts to push the Antam out of the city have been thwarted at every turn, and they're beginning to believe that there's a traitor among their ranks. Since Lucanis has been in prison and away from the Crows, he can't really be considered a suspect, so he'd be tasked with sniffing out the rat. We'd be dealing with Katarina for this whole plotline, reporting everything we find directly to her since she's First Talon and this is such a covert operation. Since she doesn't trust Lucanis, and because she expects complete control and utter obedience, Katarina would demand to know absolutely every detail, every minuscule bit of information Lucanis finds, and every minor move that he makes in his quest to find the traitor. Each time we see her, Katarina would have plenty of snide asides to lob at Lucanis for being captured and for being a demon-possessed abomination, and she'd be way overly affectionate to Ilario, who's become the favorite since Lucanis went MIA. This would make for some great conversations between Rook and Lucanis where he would initially defend her behavior. She's First Talon. Sure, she's stuck in her ways, but she made the Crows what they are today. But just behind his words would be the first seeds of doubt. There would be an early mission where Katarina forces Lucanis and Rook into the Treviso sewers on a wild goose chase for the traitor. The mission would go sideways, and they'd be ambushed by a group of Antam and Venatori soldiers. As a reaction to the Crows' assault on the prison, the Venatori would be openly supporting the Antam's invasion, and that's when Lucanis would lose all self-control. He's been forced to traipse around in refuse, his dignity is in tatters, and now he's being confronted with the symbols of his torment and the oppression of the people of his city. Spite would take control, and we would see his full form for the first time. He would cut through our enemies with an animalistic intensity, a far cry from Lucanis' more precise fighting style. And after the fight, Spite and Lucanis would war with each other over control of the body, and they'd argue about Katarina's mistreatment of them and their shared misery. Rook would have to talk him down and get Lucanis to resurface, but not before Spite lashes out and gives Rook a minor injury. Lucanis would be horrified by this, but it would only strengthen his resolve. He'd convince himself that Katerina is doing what she must. He sees the crows as his family, and he wants to find the traitor, kill them, and then wipe out the whole of the Antam and Venatori armies. And then, finally, he wants to find a way to separate himself from Spite, even if it means taking his own life. Spite, for his part, would be perfectly happy with this arrangement. He doesn't want to be part of Lucanis either, and if Lucanis died, then Spite would get to go back to the Fade. But as long as they're together, then Spite is going to turn his negative emotions towards Katerina and the crows, and make Lucanis' mission way harder than it has to be. At least until he gets bored. Searching for the traitor would also set the stage for the player to learn a lot about the ruthless inner workings of the crows, because we'd be digging through all the layers of the organization. That would provide a lot of opportunities to learn about Lucanis, the cruelties with which he was raised, and the fierce loyalty that's been instilled in him. At multiple points, Rook could either encourage Lucanis to lean into that culture of brutality, or take a step back and realize how that might have negatively affected him. Still, being back with the crows, but not fully being accepted by them, would really get under Lucanis' skin. His family and his city are all that he has, and being rejected by one half of that equation is just as painful as being tortured by the Venatori. But he'd do his best not to let us know just how much it gets to him. I imagine Lucanis being extremely emotionally closed off, kind of like a brick wall we have to delicately chisel away at in order to let the light in. But all that repressed emotion would be a hotbed for spite activity. He would take over Lucanis at the group's headquarters and put Lucanis and everyone else's lives in danger with sporadic, violent episodes. And in his most malicious mood, he'd even try to provoke someone into attacking and killing Lucanis so Spite might finally be free. This would obviously cause some tension with the team, but especially with the monster hunter Davrin and loyal scout Harding, who both deeply distrust Lucanis and would assume that he was going to turn on them at any moment. After all, being a killer for hire and an abomination is not exactly the most trustworthy of combinations. Their comments would force Lucanis even further into isolation, and he would board up his window and install a set of chains by his bed that he would bind himself in every night. Rook could either agree with the others that this is the best course of action, or try to tell Lucanis that he doesn't need to go to such drastic measures. Either way, he insists it's the right thing to do, but more open-minded members of the team, like Nev or Emmerich, would make a point of visiting Lucanis in his room, bringing him coffee, and delighting him with stories of their adventures. Eventually, during a mission entrusted to us by Katerina, we would uncover evidence that her prized boy Ilario may very well be the traitorous crow. There are letters written in his hand at an Antam outpost that contain very secret information. Lucanis' first instinct would be to run right to Katerina, but Spite would offer an alternative solution. Just eliminate Ilario themselves. Lucanis would see the logic in this, and his reasoning would depend on how the player had RP'd their Rook thus far. If Rook had spent the entire game telling Lucanis to lean into those crueler parts of crow culture, then he'd want to impress Katerina by bringing her Ilario's head. And if Rook had tried to help Lucanis see that he'd been mistreated by the crows, then he'd assume Katerina wouldn't believe him and that he'd need further, more concrete proof of Ilario's misdeeds. Either way, Lucanis and Rook tail Ilario through the city and follow him into a Venatori hideout. Once inside, they try to confront Ilario, but discover that he isn't of his own mind. He just walks right by them. And Lucanis, having been experimented on in prison, immediately recognizes the signs. Somebody is controlling Ilario with blood magic, and as they follow him further into the Venatori hideout, they discover who that someone is.
Lucanis, my poor boy.
It's Katerina. Gold stars to everyone who figured that out. Yeah, so in the finished game, the big bad of Lucanis' storyline is a woman named Zara Renata, and she is so unimportant that we made it this far into the video without ever having mentioned her name. As the story goes, she's the main woman who experimented on Lucanis in prison, and when the crows discover that there's a traitor in their midst, it turns out to be Lucanis' cousin Ilario. And he and Zara are working together to dethrone Katerina as first Talon and install Ilario as the head of the crows instead. Zara is an extremely underwhelming villain, and she suffers from a lot of the same tonal dissonance as the rest of the game does. It's another great example of how showing us a disturbing visual doesn't equate to mature storytelling. She's literally bathing in blood when we meet her, and that should be an incredibly disturbing scene to stumble on, but it isn't. First of all, from a writing perspective, we haven't built up this woman as an adversary or even really a character before this moment. We only ever hear her name said in a distasteful tone, and we never see what she's capable of before we're just thrown into a boss battle with her. And the look of the scene doesn't sell the straight-up debauchery on display. It feels like we just stepped into some lady's unhinged self-care routine and she started monologuing at us. And so meeting her like this is more awkward than intimidating. One of the game's storyboard artists, Nick Thornborough, put some of his work from Veilguard on his personal website. It showcases, among other things, a couple beautiful pieces of Zara and Ilario. And you can see that at some point in development, their relationship was supposed to be much more explicitly sexual. And that's fine. I mean, it would have given them something as far as a motive and connection are concerned, but it's still pretty weak. I personally think that the game would be better if Zara just straight up didn't exist, and we instead supplanted Katarina into her role in the story. And I mean that literally. I want to see Granny in that bloodbath. That's kind of a joke, but I do genuinely think that seeing the stuffy, matronly Katarina just revel in this sort of ghoulish hedonism would really sell just how wicked this scene really is. Rook and Lucanis would watch from a distance as she disrobes, steps into the bath, and speaks to Ilario. As she soaks, she would begin to de-age, just as Zara does in the finished game. She'd ask her brainwashed charge if he'd fulfilled all of his duties, and when he said that he had, she would say that he did well, and that she'll miss him when he's gone, when he's taken the fall for her, but that this is all very necessary. She needs to buy just a little more time as her plan gets fully underway, and Ilario's death will halt the search for the traitor, at least for a little while. Driven by hubris, Katarina has secretly allied herself with the Antam and Venatori. She's been feeding them information and allowing them to increase their numbers in Treviso until they can amass a fighting force large enough to take on the Crows. Once they do that, Katarina's plan is to announce the alliance and publicly execute any of the other Talons that try to override her decision. And if it came to a civil war, then so be it. With the Antam and Venatori armies at their side, any Crow loyal to Katarina would inevitably win that battle. And with the knowledge of Venatori blood magic secrets, Katarina could stay in power for years, because as far as she's concerned, she's the only one willing to make the tough decisions that would guarantee the survival of the Crows. This would push Lucanis over the edge. A strong and healthy Crow organization is one thing, but allying with their closest enemies, the same ones that destroyed his life and displaced his people, using the same magic that they used to torture him with, this would be a betrayal that he cannot abide. He'd step out into the middle of the room in a rage so forceful that Rook would initially think that spite had taken over. But it's all Lucanis, and he's ready for a fight. Pointing his dagger at Katarina in the bath, he'd challenge her directly, but she has other plans. She'd send the mind-controlled Ilario into the fight like a big, tanky, sacrificial lamb while she meddled from a distance, calling forth blood waves that stagger you if you don't dodge them, and disappearing into the bath only to pop up for a sneak attack and resubmerge. And once Ilario's health got to about a third of its max, she'd send him into a bloodlust frenzy where his attacks are faster and deal more damage. If you can't tell, I'm spending a lot of time on this boss fight because I find Zara's fight and pretty much every boss in the game to be exceedingly boring and repetitive. The dragons are especially guilty of this, with each one being a copy and paste of the last one, but with a different elemental hazard. I actually really like Veilguard's action RPG combat system from a user end. I find the fluidity with which Rook fights to be really satisfying, and while I think that the skill tree is really bloated, I do like the class system. I play a spellsword in basically any game that lets me, and Veilguard's version of that playstyle is super fun, but we aren't given enough enemy variety to match Rook's combat energy. During my first playthrough of Veilguard, I found myself knocking back the difficulty of most boss fights, not because they were hard, but because they were just a slog and I wanted to get through them. We desperately needed more diverse battle tactics and crowd control techniques, and simplifying our companions definitely didn't help in that persistent feeling of tedium. But anyway, Ilario mini-boss fight. He's in a frenzy. We'd launch into a cutscene where Ilario gets the upper hand on Lucanis. He almost kills him. His blade is at his throat, and then Spite shows himself. This would be a different form, a mix of Spite and Lucanis rather than one taking over the other. Similar in design to one of Thornborough's storyboards. They would attack Ilario as one. For the first time, Spite is protecting Lucanis rather than vying for control. Together they beat Ilario into submission, and Lucanis asks Spite not to kill him. He's not the one that deserves their fury. But Spite can't be contained. He still holds a grudge against the Crows for leaving Lucanis, and by extension Spite, to languish in prison. Lucanis pleads with him, but Spite won't hear it. He knows Lucanis' thoughts and emotions. He knows that deep down, Lucanis hates the Crows for what they did to him. Lucanis would weakly deny this and struggle to keep Spite from killing his cousin, and The fight would unleash a powerful surge of magical energy that drew everyone into Lucanis' mind, and this would begin my version of Lucanis' Inner Demons quest. In the finished game, Lucanis has this quest called Inner Demons, which is the game's attempt at showing us a character grappling with their personal issues. We're told, rather abruptly, that Lucanis' dead grandmother is actually alive, and Lucanis immediately shuts down. Like, literally. The scene is really awkward in its writing and directing. Taya and Viago drop this bombshell revelation about Katarina on us while standing in the middle of a bar. Lucanis isn't animated or voiced to be particularly distraught, which is pretty consistent with the rest of the game. So Spite suddenly takes over Lucanis' body and whisks Rook away into the recesses of his mind. It's there that we learn of Lucanis' deep-seated insecurities about being an abomination, and his belief that he's lost his identity and competency since his time in prison. I love a broody sad boy, so this should be right up my alley, but the quest just doesn't do any of these issues justice. It pays lip service to the idea of a damaged man dealing with trauma, but it pulls back before there's any kind of meaningful meditation on his emotions or how to deal with them. It's literally just Rook casually strolling through Lucanis' darkest thoughts and soothing them with basic therapy speech. It reads as if these writers have never actually experienced hardship before, and their best advice for dealing with layered, complex problems is just to stop worrying about it so much. It's like when a 12-year-old writes their first slash fiction about Sam and Frodo and they want to weave in a complicated subplot about the existential yearning for someone you can't have, but they've never experienced that feeling before because they're a child, and so they just write in a bunch of longing glances and hope that covers their bases. To choose a random example. In my reimagined version of Inner Demons, jumping into Lucanis' mind would hopefully feel a little more cinematic since it's tied to a high-intensity boss fight. And once we get in there, I'm imagining fewer civil conversations and more spiritual representations of figures in Lucanis' life, making him relive his worst fears and anxieties. Rook and Lucanis would have to puzzle their way through various rooms of his early life with the Crows, his stint in the Venatori prison, and the vitriol from Davrin and Harding, while Spite's disembodied voice tries to persuade Lucanis to give in to his negative emotions. Am I basically just pitching the Veilguard version of the Scarecrow Nightmare sequences from the Batman Arkham games? Yeah, but do I think it would work? Absolutely. And these would be real puzzles, by the way. I find the puzzles in Veilguard to be insultingly simple, and they never vary in difficulty from the tutorial to the end of the game. Point the big beam at the glowing thing. Follow the bright red pulsing vein and destroy the big orb. Press RB and let your companion do the rest. I'd love some variety with some logic-based riddles, or movement-based puzzles, or time-based ones. Anything to break up the monotony. There's this unintentionally hilarious moment in one of the tutorial levels when Rook and Nev and Balara are all like,
And another resonance amplifier.
Should be the last one, I hope.
Fingers crossed.
even the characters are bored, and we're not even an hour into this game. But anyway, being presented with all of the trauma that Lucanis has tried so hard to bury would be absolutely crushing for him. He would have to confront the fact that the Crows, his family, are directly or indirectly the cause of almost all of it. With Rook's help, he would see that none of this is black and white. He doesn't owe the Crows his undying fealty, but not all of them are irredeemable monsters either. Some of them were just swept up into the system like he was. And while some members of Rook's team distrust him, he's also found companionship with people like Nev and Emmerich. Even Spite is not a total evil entity. Neither he nor Lucanis wanted their fates to be tied together. And he could have let Lucanis die at Ilario's hand, but he didn't. He protected him. This would lead to the same discussion with Spite that's in the finished game, or close to it at least. With Rook's guidance, Lucanis and Spite could either A, come to begrudgingly respect one another and decide to stick together and direct their combined strength at the people who most deserve it, or B, form an uneasy truce just long enough to bring Katarina to justice and stop the Venatori and Elven gods from rising to power, and then find a way to split from one another for good. Once that's decided, everyone would be snapped back to reality, and Ilario will come to, while Katarina is nowhere to be found. Ilario had promised to inform Taya and Viago what happened here, and a later mission would see the Crows locating Katarina's new hideout and hunting her down to kill her. Everyone would join the fight against a now youthful-looking Katarina flanked by Venatori and Antam guards, and once she's beaten, Lucanis would stand over her and demand to know why she did this. She would tell us that the world is changing. The Crows have always lent their services to the richest and most powerful people in the room. For decades, those rich and powerful people were useless, weak-minded Antivan bureaucrats. but now the tides of power are turning, and the crows need to make sure they aren't pulled under the waves. Those bureaucrats are running scared, and some of them are even turning on the crows. The Antam and Venatori have proven to be formidable forces, and Katarina sees their hostile takeover as an inevitability. In her mind, it's better to ally with the winning side now, rather than risk the destruction of the crows altogether later. Obviously, this wouldn't be winning over any hearts and minds, but Katarina's words wouldn't be falling entirely on deaf ears. We would be able to see in Lucanis' face that her comment about the crows being bought by anyone who can afford them has hit him particularly hard, because she's not wrong. She'd try to pull the elderly grandmother card as her short-lived youth wastes away, and depending on how you've played the game so far, Rook would get similar choices to the ones they do in the finished game when Lucanis is trying to decide how to deal with Ilario. That being asking Lucanis to go easy, telling him to show no mercy, or letting him decide for himself. This would be a great way for Lucanis to symbolically continue the pattern of familial violence or be the one to break the cycle. And whenever he decides, we would fade out on a shot of Katarina's body, either exhausted or lifeless, covered in the literal and metaphorical blood of her people. Taya and Viago would be so overjoyed that they'd want to make Lucanis the Talon of House Dellamorte. Not make him first Talon like they do in the finished game. I don't think he deserves that, but I do think that being the head of his house is a fitting reward. Depending on which way Rook has been encouraging Lucanis this whole time, he would either accept this offer and rejoin the Crows, or decline it and cut ties with the organization. If he accepts, then he and Rook would spend the night living it up with the Crows. If he declines, then he'd head back home with Rook and we'd be privy to a short scene. Davrin would say something snide about half hoping they'd never see him again, and Nev would chastise him for it. Exhausted and frankly traumatized, Lucanis would tell them what happened, and the atmosphere in the room would soften. By this point in the story, they've all seen their fair share of death, torment, and complicated family ties. Davrin would apologize for his remark, Harding would offer to put on a pot of coffee, and Lucanis would say he'd rather do it if it's all the same. Everyone would laugh, and we'd end on a very wholesome found family note. From there, Lucanis' bedroom would change so that the window is no longer boarded and the curtains are drawn back so that the light can come in. And if he'd chosen to rejoin the Crows, then he'd have their sigil hanging up on the wall. And if he'd chosen the Veilguard team, then he'd have the coffee pot and mugs from the cutscene up on a shelf somewhere. And of course, this would all pair with the Crows storyline, which would run in tandem and also needs its own rewrite. Part 3. Reimagining the Crows. Since Rook still needs allies, they would be working with these morally gray crows, either out of a genuine desire or out of necessity, depending on how you were personally RPing your character. The crow quests would be given to us by Talons Taya and Viago, and they would mainly focus on attempting to destabilize the Antam presence in Treviso, and learning more about their leader, the Butcher. But in an ideal world, there would also be a much larger political thread woven throughout. In the finished version of Veilguard, the character of Governor Evenchi is a lot like Zara Renata, in that he's so inconsequential to the Crow's story that this is the first time you're hearing his name.
Who is this?
This is Governor Evenchi.
This is Editing Ash here, just popping in for a quick note. I had no idea while I was filming this video, but apparently Governor Evenchi is actually non-binary. I had no idea, so when I wrote the script and filmed the video, I used the wrong pronouns for them, and I'm sorry about that. Like Ilario, Evenchi is a backstabbing traitor working with the enemy, and it's framed like this is supposed to be a twist, but this dude barely resists twirling his evil mustache in every scene he's in. And for those of you keeping count, yes, not only do Lucanis and the Crow storylines have 2 fake-out deaths, they also have 2 twist traitors. Absolutely groundbreaking storytelling, you guys. Truly great stuff. In the full release of the game, Taya and Viago tell us,
Antiva has no army. It has the Crows.
There's a reason Antivan coins have portraits of guild leaders, not royalty.
Evenchi has a problem with this, and honestly I think it's pretty valid to be concerned that so much of your government is dependent on an assassin's guild that didn't stop a renegade group of Qunari extremists from taking over your city. In my reimagining, Evenchi wouldn't be a traitor working with the Antam. He would instead be the head of a neutral opposition party to the Crows in Antivan politics. Remember when I was explaining Katarina's motivations to ally herself with the Antam and Venatori, and I said, those bureaucrats are running scared, and some of them are even turning on the Crows. This is the bureaucrat turning on the Crows. I'd like to see him amass a kind of citizens' army and work to pass legislation that limits the Crows' involvement in official government business. We'd bump into him during Crow missions, and he would try to sway us to his side of the conflict. And meanwhile, every time we saw the Butcher, he would be pleading his case for the city. I actually love the character of the Butcher in the finished game. He might be the most interesting villain we have outside of Solus, and it's a shame that he's so underutilized. So my reimagining would see us run into the Butcher several times over the course of the Crow's story, and during those meetings he would be as polite, passionate, and logical as he is in the finished game. During the final mission for the Crows, we would be tasked with assassinating the Butcher, but Evenchi and his citizens' army would show up and offer us another solution. He wants to storm the Antom base of operations and arrest the Butcher so he might stand trial before being cast out of the city. Not only would this put a stop to the bloodshed, but it would give Evenchi the political edge he needs to show the Antivan public that the government can get along just fine without the Crows. It's up to Rook which side they choose to ally themselves with. If they choose the Crows, then they remain one of the main players in Antivan politics. If Rook chose Evenchi, then the Crows would still exist, but they would forfeit a significant chunk of their political power. We would lose them as allies, and Evenchi's citizens' army would replace them for the final battle at the end of the main quest of the game. Obviously, if Lucanis' personal quest ended with him rejoining with the Crows, then he would disapprove of siding with Evenchi. But if he walked away from the Crows, then he would approve. Oh, and by the way, you would essentially be playing both this story and Lucanis' personal quest on hard mode, depending on the decision that you made during the Big Choice. Part 4. The Big Choice. Or lack thereof. Are you ready for my big tangent of the video? No? That's okay, we'll get through it together. So this moment that I like to call the Big Choice comes in at about 2/3 of the way through Act 1.
Treviso and Minrathis are both under attack.
Blighted dragons. 2 of them. 1 for each city.
What's our move, Rook?
It's really where Veilguard kind of went off the rails for me, and Lucanis, not so coincidentally, makes up about 50% of the problem. It's not like the game was going great before the Big Choice, but this was the catalyst for a steep decline in quality, and to understand why I feel that way, we need a little context, both in-game and in real life. Before we're presented with the Big Choice in-game, Solus, the elven god of lies and former hero of the Inquisition, tries to rip a hole in the veil between the mortal realm and the Fade with a magic dagger, only to accidentally imprison himself and release 2 reject Dark Souls bosses instead. RIP, C+, not your best work. Those reject Dark Souls bosses are Algernon and Gillenane, 2 more ancient elven gods, and they've started to wreak havoc on Thedas because they're hellbent on world domination. Their first big display of strength is a 2-pronged attack on the cities of Minrathis and Treviso, and now it's up to Rook to decide which city they want to save. Minrathis is heavily fortified and packed full of powerful mages, so theoretically fewer lives would be lost in the oncoming battle. But an attack on the city would provide ample cover for government takeover by the Venatori, which would mean the entire continent could fall under fascist reign. Treviso, on the other hand, is a city already under siege by an entirely different group of aggressors. The Antom have muscled their way in. It's not a political powerhouse like Minrathis, but it's basically undefended because their main source of strength comes from a freaking assassins guild. It's in a weakened state, and it's reasonable to assume that the city will incur massive damage if left to its own devices. To make the player's choice more difficult, 2 of our companions are begging for Rook's help to save their city. Nev asks for support in Minrathis, while Lucanis wants Rook to save his hometown of Treviso. And whichever city you choose, the character from the opposite city will feel slighted and harbor resentment for Rook. But not like actual resentment, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's important to understand that, narratively, this choice is already pretty frustrating. It's not like this is an all-or-nothing decision. Rook only takes half of the team to their chosen city, and the other half of the team goes to the other city, so it's not like either one is left totally undefended by our party. And at this critical junction, Rook hasn't really done much to cement himself as the leader of the team, other than be the one to stand in front of everybody and strike a hero pose. They're probably the least powerful and influential person here, so their presence should not make or break the fate of a location. The magic dagger Rook has on their hip is the key factor in all of this. It's the reason they're able to successfully repel the enemy forces at whichever city they choose to save. But neither the player nor the characters know that. As far as Rook is concerned, all they did at that moment was decide which city they personally went to. If the devs wanted this to be a more dramatic beat, then all they had to do was write it so that Rook takes the entire team to their city, and then Nev or Lucanis defies orders and goes to their home instead. That would give Nev or Lucanis more of a reason to be mad at Rook, and give an asshole Rook a reason to chew them out for ignoring commands. And then that would either drive a wedge further between those characters, or it would provide space to mend those damaged bonds. Now, I have a confession to make about the big choice, and it's going to enrage a certain section of this fandom. Forgive me, Andraste, for I have sinned because I saved Minrathous. And I know this is a controversial decision because the devs themselves said that they thought the obvious choice was to save Treviso. In a Reddit AMA on Dragon Age Day 2024, game director Corinne Bush said, "The biggest surprise for me in the telemetry is that the save Minrathous Treviso choice is basically split 50-50. We were all anticipating that saving Treviso would be the clear winner, but I'm happy to see that it's not so cut and dry." Okay. I have been thinking about these two sentences since they were posted last year. The choice between the two cities is the biggest and most impactful one in the game. It's basically the only one with any long-lasting implications for the rest of the story. And that's not just my opinion. During that same Reddit AMA, Bush also admitted that no other choice in the game is on that same scale. When writing interactive media with branching outcomes, you want to make sure that all of those outcomes feel like valid decisions the player can make, and that those decisions actually make a difference. So the fact that the development team for Veilguard thought that there was a clear winner for the largest scale choice in the game is just asinine. That's the only word I can come up with. Other BioWare titles understand this for the most part, and they have exponentially more choices with a deeper impact. But in Veilguard, we just get this one choice, and it's heavily stacked in Treviso and Lucanis' favor. And to make that favoritism doubly clear, they go ahead and destroy Minrathous at the end of the game anyway, making the choice to save it even less viable. Like I said, I chose to save Minrathous, and I did that for a few reasons. The first is that I thought it made more strategic sense to defend a political powerhouse from a fascist uprising than to save a city that was basically already lost to a violent group of interlopers. Second, I had chosen the Shadow Dragon faction in character creation, so Minrathous was my rook's home. And the third reason was that I was trying to romance Lucanis, and I thought saving Minrathous over Treviso would add some drama into the relationship, which I was desperate for. Part 5. Conflict? More like non-flict. I mentioned earlier that one of my favorite parts about Dragon Age Inquisition, and one of my favorite parts about BioWare games in general, is their focus on interpersonal relationships, and how a lot of those times those interpersonal relationships are full of friction. You can straight up kick people out of the Inquisition and punch people in the face if you want to. Romancing Sarah as a so-called elfie elf brings up a lot of interesting and heated discussions about culture, religion, and responsibility. You can argue with Dorian about the practice of keeping slaves. Solus and Iron Bull disagree with each other over the teachings of the Qun, and Cassandra and Varric's enemies to friends arc is one of the cutest bits of the game. These characters' quirks and flaws make them who they are, and overcoming their differences makes the group and the narrative stronger. Up until the big choice in Veilguard, there is basically none of that interpersonal drama that I had come to know and expect from these types of experiences. So I was really excited when, upon returning to Treviso after repelling the dragon attack in Minrathous, the city was in shambles and Lucanis and the Crows were heartbroken. Finally, I thought, I've made an impact on this world and its characters. Maybe now the Crows will be less willing allies and I'll have to work to rebuild trust with Lucanis.
There's not going to be
an impact on this world and its characters.
You stupid slut.
Imagine my surprise when one of the first things Lucanis and his Crows tell me is that they don't blame me for my decision to save Minrathous.
We do not fault your loyalty to your people, Rook, but Treviso has suffered.
Basically, they're not mad. They're just disappointed. Outside of one or two fairly inconsequential NPCs, none of these literal assassins have anything bad to say about Rook or the rest of the party.
Saying you missed out on the dragon excitement we had. Although I'm glad you helped the Shadow Dragons.
You're not upset I chose to go to Minrathous?
Of course not.
Taya and Viago, our two main Crows, even go out of their way to be super nice and invite you to attend a funeral for the fallen. Yes, Treviso is in ruins, and I frankly adore the way they've designed the city to be so overtaken by the Blight. It's a really great display of power from our enemies that puts the stakes into perspective, and it's way more visually arresting than the alternative Blighted Minrathous. And once the city is destroyed, the Crow's story mainly revolves around go here, kill this style missions, so there is an effect on the narrative technically, it just manifests itself in extremely dull, action-focused missions. But there are no greater political or strategic issues that arise from the big choice. As long as you complete most of their missions, the Crows still show up for the big battles in the main quest, and as for Lucanis, well, On paper, I actually really like Lucanis' reaction to the choice to save Minrathous. He goes back to Treviso to help in the relief effort, which means that mechanically he's unselectable for a few missions. He won't be in his usual spot in the kitchen pantry, and a very helpful and not at all unnecessary tooltip tells us that he doesn't have time for a romance with Rook. Not that he's too angry at Rook, or that he blames them for what happened in Treviso, just that he doesn't have time. This is an important distinction, and we will be circling back to it later. When Lucanis finally returns to the lighthouse, he's hardened against the player, which means he can't perform healing actions on Rook in combat, some of his offensive abilities are more powerful, and I'm going to refrain from making any childish jokes. Again, this is great. We get consequences from a gameplay perspective, which is exactly what I want. But, he never actually voices his feelings. I want to say that he gives Rook the silent treatment, but that implies some passive aggression, and we don't even get that level of a reaction from him. There is no aggression here, it is pure passivity. He spends his days sitting in the pantry, drinking coffee, and telling us he doesn't have time to chat. Keep in mind that before the big choice, my Rook was trying to romance Lucanis. I found myself returning to the lighthouse kitchen constantly, yearning for some kind of knockdown, drag-out fight, or tearful discussion about broken bonds and hurt feelings, or even a mature conversation about where to go from here. But instead, I was greeted by nothing more than a polite coworker, and when Veilguard was sold on the idea of this being a found family, this lack of response really stung. In my dream reimagining of this story arc, it would of course start with the idea that Rook took the entire team to their chosen city rather than just half. Lucanis and the Crows would both be furious, and it would affect both stories. For the Crows, if the city was destroyed, then some of the later missions would be swapped out for Blight-related quests like the ones that are already in the game. Taya and Viago would be way more hostile and rude until you can prove you're there to help, and their failure to stop the spread of the Blight would give Evenchi even more of a reason to disrupt the Crows' political position. The Assassins aren't exactly the group of people you want to go to for medical aid, water purification, and reconstruction efforts after all. And Lucanis would still disappear for a few missions, but this time his departure would be explosive. He'd ream Rook out in front of the entire team and scream at anyone who got in his way, showing us an emotionally heated side that we would rarely get to see. He would only stop when Spite tries to take advantage of the situation and take control of his body. He would calm himself down and storm out. When he finally returns, he would be hardened, just like he is in the finished game, and he would make it plainly known that the only reason he's there is because he made a promise, and a Crow always fulfills their contracts. As you rebuild his approval score, Lucanis would go from bitter resentment to unsteady tolerance to a genuine companion and possible lover, but in between there would be plenty of that currently non-existent conflict. And of course, if you decided to save Treviso instead, then Lucanis would have an even higher esteem for you while you'd have to battle for Nev's approval. And the two of them would have to mend their relationship through passive dialogue at the lighthouse or during missions. The finished game's refusal to engage with conflict is, of course, an issue throughout. Every problem raised, big or small, is immediately quelled or ignored outright. Bringing it back to Lucanis, the man is literally introduced as the Mage Killer. A Mage Rook can bring up that fact to Nev, but she playfully bats it away as being not a big deal, and that's pretty much the end of that. He's also possessed by a literal spite demon, and the worst that comes from that plotline is that Tosh has to berate him like a misbehaving dog once or twice.
Smells like melon and wood smoke.
Hey! No! No! Sit your ass back down.
Many of the companions have lines referencing Spite, but it never actually amounts to conflict between the two characters. Like, listen to this conversation between Davrin and Nev.
I heard you and Lucanis arguing.
Had a difference of opinion.
Is that all? Sounded like you were ready to kill each other.
If Spite starts trouble, it might come to that.
A bit early to jump there.
We're talking about a demon.
This sounds like Davrin and Lucanis should be constantly at each other's throats, but at this point in my game, I'd never even seen the two of them interact with each other. The whole beef plays out exclusively in easily missable dialogue, without any scenes or meaningful discussions between the two of them. The biggest fight Lucanis finds himself in is with Davrin later on, after failing to assassinate Gillenane, and even that is relegated to about 2 cutscenes before they squash it entirely like nothing happened. And it isn't just external conflicts that the game is shy about confronting, it's internal ones too. We already talked about how awkward Lucanis' Inner Demons quest is, but he's not the only one that suffers from this lack of internal complexity. Davrin is a Grey Warden, which means he knows his life has a divinely determined expiration date, and it's shorter than most. He expects that date to come during a quest where he tries to sacrifice himself for the cause, but he miraculously survives, and everything he thought to be true gets thrown out the window. You'd think this would cause some kind of a crisis in Davrin, and we do get a genuinely great little monologue after the fact. But instead of letting Davrin sit with those emotions, the moment is immediately ruined by him making a joke about truffles.
I feel like a blade sharpened all these years to confront the worst darkness in the world. And my blade struck true at Weishaupt. What now?
Well, you'll raise a sun to create a world where the light outshines the darkness.
Yeah? Well, let me tell you. That will require a lot more gingerwort truffles.
And then we never speak of it again. It is maddening, you guys. The exception to Veilguard's aversion to conflict is Tosh and their relationship with their mother, but I would argue that even that is handled pretty clumsily. Tosh is understandably angry and confused. They're coming to terms with their non-binary identity while battling the two sides of their cultural upbringing against one another, and they're dealing with a world-ending blight. It's kind of a lot to take in. They direct this anger and confusion at their mother, who honestly doesn't deserve it. Yes, Shathan is emotionally unavailable and overly strict, but she does try her hardest to accept Tosh for who they are. And for a woman who got this sprung on them in the middle of dinner...
So, I'm non-binary.
I respect her for coming around to this in such a short time.
They are stronger than you will ever be.
The argument for this lack of conflict is that all of the characters are pretty focused on the whole elven gods trying to take over the world thing, but that's a weak excuse. Every one of Veilguard's predecessors had big, world-altering main plots that required the party's full attention, but they still found time to bicker amongst each other.
Well, aside from the fact that she's a complete and utter bitch, no, I don't like her at all.
I don't know if you've noticed, but our world is kind of on fire right now, and I'm sure if you check the comments of this video, you'll see someone picking a fight with me over my decision to save Minrathous, or telling me that I'm an idiot for thinking that we didn't get a resolution for Davrin's Archdemon storyline. At their core, Dragon Age games tell very human stories about very human characters, and all of these seemingly petty disputes are extremely important to the human experience. Another important aspect of the human experience, at least for some of us, is romance. And once again, Lucanis provides a perfect example of Veilguard's failings. Part 6. Romance? More like fomance. Can you guys tell how long this video is taking? Because the sun is set. The sun has set. Before Veilguard came out, a lot of the writers were very vocal online about what players could expect from the game, the characters, and their romances. Corinne Bush laid it on especially thick, promising nudity and unprecedented levels of spice. And, no? Despite my obsession with Baldur's Gate 3, I'm actually not a big fan of video game sex scenes. They tend to look like someone's just mashing two dolls together, so I'm not gonna sit here and demand to see Lucanis hang demon dong. But if you're going to include romance in your video game, then those relationships should feel intimate. And intimacy doesn't just mean rolling around naked, but even still, Veilguard's romances are severely lacking in any kind of semblance of intimacy. Lucanis gets the short end of the stick here, and not just because he's a short king. He just objectively has the least amount of scenes, romantic or otherwise, and his characterization is often confused, not unlike the rest of the characters in the game. There's Balara.
Ruined a lot of relationships. Most of the people I've been with didn't care for it. I've never done this. Not really.
You've never had a romantic relationship?
Well, one. For a little while.
And then there's Tosh. With Tosh's mother being very accepting and also very dead by the end of their story, the last issue for Tosh to overcome is that of their twin cultures. They are part Quinari and part Ravani, and they have to navigate those diverting paths. And how is that issue resolved? What is their big choice? Well, I'll tell you. Rook gets to choose which of their two cultural identities they should embrace. Yeah, the non-binary character presents a binary choice to the player, which doesn't really amount to anything other than a slight visual difference in the character model.
You don't get to tell me who I am.
Actually, we do, Tosh. We do get to tell you who you are, and I hate it. Lucanis isn't any better. The version of him that we romance is presented as a suave seducer. And yet the man has self-admittedly never been in a relationship before, and the one that he enters into with Rook is utterly devoid of physical or emotional connection, despite him being the most passionate of all of the companions. He almost never feels like he's your actual partner. Outside of the very specific and very short scenes with him, he barely knows you exist. We don't even see Rook and Lucanis kiss on camera until close to the end of the game, right before their fade to black implied sex scene. And before you say anything, I know that there's extra spicy information in the codex entries, but nobody reads those things except for nerds like me, and your play experience should not have to rely on supplementary reading material to be satisfying. Lucanis' writer, the incredibly talented Mary Kirby, called Lucanis a dumpster fire and a bisexual disaster ahead of the release. She also claims to have written him to be pan and demisexual, and I don't think she was lying. I think that she probably wrote a character that fits that description. He just didn't end up making it into the game. I agree that Lucanis is a dumpster fire, just not in the way that Kirby was intending. And I guess you could make a case for him being demi, since we see so little romantic tension between him and Rook, but when your strongest argument is a lack of content, then that doesn't bode well for the romance arc. And for the record, I don't think that Bush was lying when she said that this game was supposed to be steamy. Circling back to that Nick Thornborough art, his website showcases an incredible amount of cut content from the romances, and here again Lucanis has done the dirtiest. There's this beautiful piece of Lucanis and Rook on a gondola drifting down the Treviso canals, and this one of the two of them swimming together in front of a waterfall. We have a kiss in the rain, and one of Lucanis turning regretfully away from Rook while still holding onto them like his life depends on it. And this one, I mean, the ones who get it, get it. There's more affection and care packed into these simple storyboards than there is in Lucanis' entire romance arc, and that's frankly depressing. I had no idea who I'd be romancing when I loaded up the game for the first time, and Lucanis charmed me immediately by taking Rook to the Treviso marketplace and buying up various items for the other members of the party.
Fresh fruit. Nev only eats fried fish. You'd think a detective would have discovered scurvy by now. Bellara mentioned the daedalus seafood recipe she wants to make.
A potted plant?
For Harding's garden. Spearman is supposed to calm bad dreams.
This was such an excellent way to showcase his attention to detail and introduce us to a location that's very important in the story. And the flirting that you get to do during your little coffee date afterwards is just incredible. But there's no follow-through. When you commit to a relationship with Lucanis, the promise of that relationship is just never fulfilled. And that's not even the worst part. When Lucanis is hardened against Rook like he was for my playthrough, you're shut out of his romance, which, okay, fine. You also miss out on that aforementioned Inner Demons quest, which is such an inconceivable choice for a character that already suffers from a lack of content, but whatever. What's worse than that is, while a hardened Lucanis will not romance Rook, he will romance another companion, and that companion is Nev. Yeah, he romances the woman that stood right beside him and convinced Rook to forsake Treviso from Imrathis instead. And I know that it's ultimately Rook's decision, but you're telling me the man with a literal spite demon inside him wouldn't be just as angry at Nev as he is at Rook? Actually, he isn't angry. That very helpful and not at all unnecessary tooltip told us specifically that Lucanis doesn't have time for a romance because he's too focused on helping his city, and yet here he is, obliviously asking Rook for tips on how to woo Nev, even though we spent the better part of the first act of the game flirting with each other. Did our coffee date mean nothing to you, Lucanis? Even before the big choice, Lucanis is weirdly fixated on Nev. He mentions her by name a few times as if he already has a vested interest in her, despite their on-screen relationship amounting to one embarrassing nosebleed and a couple of all-hands meetings. It's extra frustrating when you've chosen the Shadow Dragon faction as your backstory, because Nev is also a Shadow Dragon. She and Rook have exactly the same motivation for choosing Imrathis over Treviso, and yet he has no problem romancing Nev while Rook gets shut out in the cold. And no, if you save Treviso, you aren't locked out of Nev's romance. She hardens, and it becomes more difficult to romance her, but you still can. You'll notice that that's literally exactly what I want from Lucanis' storyline, but for some ungodly reason, they just decided not to include it. The dev's post-launch explanation for this, by the way, is that Lucanis is a deeply passionate individual, and rightly or wrongly, can't overlook that it was Rook's decision as the leader of the Veilguard to support Imrathis. But I don't buy it, BioWare, because if that was the case, then the very helpful and not at all unnecessary tooltip would have said,
Lucanis is a deeply passionate individual, and rightly or wrongly can't overlook that it was Rook's decision as the leader of the Veilguard to support Imrathis.
But it doesn't say that, does it? And also, Everything I just said. I won't make you sit through it again. There's an emotional maturity in BioWare games that's missing from all the romances in Veilguard, and come to think of it, just the game more broadly. And this is just a weird thing I noticed, so I'm not sure where else to mention it, but there's so much repetition in the romances. Both Lucanis and Tosh have scenes where they do the anime meme hand against the wall thing, and there are 3 interrupted kisses. Lucanis, Nev, and Davrin all get one. That's weird, right? Did the writers, all read the same fanfic? How did nobody flag this? What's going on here? As far as reimagining Lucanis' romance, the best thing to do is just to add more content to his main story and then provide options for romantic dialogue and extra scenes wherever possible. Give us more discussions with Lucanis at the lighthouse where we can argue or banter and flirt, and once Rook builds up a rapport, work those gorgeous storyboards into the game. Late night reconnaissance mission in Treviso? Why not stop by one of Lucanis' favorite private spots in the city, the only Clearwater spring left after the Blight? Being sent on an errand by Katarina? Well, the most direct route to your destination is by gondola. If Davrin can take me on something like 6 separate outings to Arlithan Forest, then Lucanis deserves at least that same amount of attention and time. And if they really want an avenue that would cut off Lucanis' romance altogether, then I think it should be if you convince him to rejoin the Crows, but then side with Avenchi to remove them from power. Otherwise, we should get our happily ever after, even if we have to work a little harder to get it. And when I say happily ever after, I mean it. Part 7. Give us a freaking epilogue, you cowards. Veilguard is in desperate need of a true epilogue scene. In the finished game, each of our companions gets a single line of dialogue overlaid on top of their final illustrated hero shot as a piddling little send-off, so we can't really be sure of their fates past the generic hand wave of an ending they receive. The art book for Veilguard tells us that this wasn't always the case. The devs drafted up some more meaningful epilogues that just never made it into the finished product, but even those likely would have been still images with some VO over top. If I had my way, the epilogue would be something like the Mass Effect 3 Citadel DLC, the Inquisition Trespasser DLC, or the party scene at the end of Baldur's Gate 3. A few months or so after the adventure, the group would gather in Minrathous to be awarded for their bravery and be officially dubbed the Veilguard, since nobody ever actually uses that name in the finished game as far as I can tell, but okay. Before the ceremony, everyone would mill around in a large hall with music and refreshments, where Rook could go around and speak to each companion individually, and they'd give us some much-needed closure on all of their stories. For Lucanis, if he rejoined the Crows, he would tell us that he's been working with the Talons Tea and Viago to instill real change in the organization, including foregoing the need for a new First Talon and voting on things via committee. If the Crows were unseated politically, he'd be extremely bitter about it and probably have some kind of snide remark prepared for Rook. If they were still in power, then he'd be hopeful for their future in the city and their plans to purge the Blight if the city was destroyed. If Lucanis is no longer a Crow, then he'd be semi-retired. If Treviso was destroyed, he'd say he's been spending his time volunteering. Otherwise, he'd be exploring the outside world as a tourist for the first time since we broke him out of that Venatori prison. And depending on your romance choice, he'd either have a line about how he's enjoyed having Nev or Rook by his side for the whole thing, or that he's been enjoying his alone time. Of course, he'd only really be alone if he decided to separate from Spite. If that's the case, then Lucanis would have undergone an Avaran ritual off-screen performed by Nev and or Emmerich. They discuss how Lucanis is grateful to have his body back, but that he feels a little empty without Spite's presence. If he chose to stay connected to Spite, then the demon would make an appearance as a benevolent spirit. For those that don't know, demons in Dragon Age lore are just corrupted spirits, and they are capable of changing their nature. So, if Lucanis remains a Crow, then I'd like for Spite to become a spirit of honor, and if he leaves the Crows, then Spite would become a spirit of hope, which is supposed to be Veilguard's main theme. If Rook romanced Lucanis, then their dialogue would indicate that they're already familiar with this new spirit form. But otherwise, Rook would be pleasantly surprised by this appearance. Oh, and if Lucanis is a Crow, and they were unseated politically, then Spite would remain Spite. That's the bad ending. And of course, a romanced Lucanis would be very flirty and hint at what he and Rook are going to get up to after the ceremony. And the ceremony itself would be a New Hope-style event where we get one last look at our team as they stand proudly together in front of a cheering crowd. The end. But not really, because I'm not done complaining yet. I know this all sounds ambitious, but what's really infuriating to me is that none of this, absolutely nothing that I've talked about so far, was out of reach for Veilguard. Or at least I should say that it wasn't out of reach for Joplin. Part 8. What Could Have Been. Joplin was the name given to Dragon Age 4 during the early stages of development, and as is literally illustrated in the art book for Veilguard, the developers poured their hearts and souls into this iteration of the game. I can't go over all the details, or we'd be here for another hour at least, but just let me read a couple of quotes at you. These both come from an amazing write-up by Jason Schreier at Kotaku in 2019. You'd play as a group of spies into Vinter Imperium, a wizard-ruled country on the north end of Dragon Age's main continent, Thetis. The goal was to focus as much as possible on choice and consequence, with smaller areas and fewer fetch quests than Dragon Age Inquisition. There was an emphasis on repeat play, one developer said, noting that they wanted to make areas that changed over time and missions that branched in interesting ways based on your decisions, to the point where you could even get non-standard game overs if you followed certain paths. Lie to me and tell me that doesn't sound like a good idea. Look at the Veilguard art book. Take in these scrapped areas of Upper Minrathous, the abandoned plot where pious elven pilgrims flocked to solace in Arlethan Forest, and the more mature and noir-inspired tone, and the freaking dragon submarine home base, and tell me this idea doesn't have merit. It's very rare to get this level of insight into a video game's development, especially one like Veilguard, which pivoted so many times before its release. Looking over the art book and reading Jason Schreier's article is like uncovering a deep, forbidden knowledge for me. It's really exciting, but part of me also grieves what could have been. In 2016, the development of Joplin was put on hold as the entire team was moved over to complete the then-upcoming Mass Effect Andromeda, and we all know how that turned out. The following year, Joplin was cancelled outright, and most of the team was moved once again, this time to Anthem, which was supposed to be EA's next big moneymaker, and we all know how that turned out. What was left of the Dragon Age team was given a new directive by the C-suite. Single-player RPGs were out. The next big thing were live-action multiplayer experiences, and that's what the new Dragon Age game had to be. And so, Morrison was born. Morrison doesn't get a section in the Veilguard art book, and that's probably because it's just Veilguard, but with all of the multiplayer elements ripped out of it and the single-player elements shoved back in there at some point in development when the EA executives changed their mind again. This is why Veilguard is so visually similar to current-gen multiplayer games and why each map feels so sequestered from the rest. But even after all this flip-flopping on the part of management, the game's issues don't end here. A year out from Veilguard's release, 50 BioWare employees were laid off, including Lucanis' lead writer Mary Kirby and a number of high-ranking members of the Veilguard development team. Those who remained were forced to pick up the slack from their former coworkers and friends and also do the job that they were actually hired for. Essentially, Veilguard was completed by a skeleton crew. It was built off the corpse of one actual game and one half-baked live service. Then it got stapled together and resurrected like Frankenstein's monster through years of mismanagement, extreme time crunch, and misguided trend chasing on the part of EA's executives. The actual developers were burnt out, being pulled in 6 different directions, and probably a little disillusioned by the time Veilguard's development even got started in earnest. And then it was shipped out with very little quality control. This also helps to explain why Veilguard didn't make use of the Dragon Age Keep, the tool that kept track of players' choices in previous games and then adjusted the world state to reflect those choices. There simply wasn't enough time to create multiple meaningful avenues, and so they just blighted the whole of Southern Thetis off screen and basically gave us a blank slate. While replaying Veilguard to get footage for this video, I found myself constantly frustrated. I could see the game that this was meant to be, broken and buried under each new iteration that was just heaped on top of it. And I'm not saying this to give the devs a free pass. I think that even with this choppy and truncated development timeline, they could have done a better job than they did. But I also don't blame them for phoning it in, and I certainly didn't want them all to be fired, which is exactly what happened. After Veilguard came out, most of the rest of the team was fired, and the ones that weren't left on their own terms, presumably with their spirits crushed. Now that the dust has settled, I think it's safe to say that no matter what you personally think of the game, Veilguard was a loss for EA and BioWare. The game died by 1,000 cuts. Cut conflict, cut romances, cut meaningful choices, cut nuance, cut time, cut developers. Even if they did ultimately make money on Veilguard, they lost the goodwill of their fandom and they literally pulverized a team of veteran developers. Another quote from an unnamed BioWare employee in that Jason Schreier article says, "We were working towards something very cool. A hugely reactive game. Smaller in scope than Dragon Age Inquisition, but much larger in player choice, followers, reactivity, and depth. I'm sad that game will never get made, and I have to agree. Like our favorite assassin, these people suffered for years under the direction of more powerful forces. The thing they were most passionate about was destroyed. They had to pick up the broken pieces by themselves, and they were left with next to nothing to show for it. And that is why Lucanis represents everything wrong with Veilguard. Wow, okay, that was a long second video. If you're still here with me after all of that, all I can give you is my thanks, even though you deserve way more than that. I'm not sure what I'm going to rant about next time, but I've got a few Baldur's Gate ideas saved in my phone, so we'll see. The response to my first video was overwhelming, and you're all just so kind, so thank you for that, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye! And they're both boys. Stupid. It's a stupid joke.